Thank you very much. It's a tremendous privilege to be here. It's a tremendous privilege to be here at a time to celebrate Onora's incredibly powerful work on the ethics of communication, and a privilege to be here in a place with an organization that recognizes that, and with people who have brought out so many different aspects of this from the academy and from the real world, where it makes all the difference. My title is Post-Truth as Post-Democracy. And some of you may know that post-truth was the word of the year for the OED, for the Oxford English Dictionary in 2016. And I believe that it first was floated in 1992 in an essay by Steve Tezish in The Nation magazine. He was reflecting at that time on the Iran-Contra scandal and the Persian Gulf War, and he said, we, as a free people, have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. What I want to say today is that to the extent that we are living in a post-truth world, we are not free, and we are not a democracy. So there's something inherently contradictory in that possibility that Steve Tezish was countenancing. In talking about this, I'm going to be taking up some themes from Onora's work, which have been a big influence on me as well as many others here. One is that the problem that we face today is not a lack of trust so much as a lack of trustworthiness. Another hugely important thing, which goes far beyond the ethics of communication, is the relationship between duties and rights, and how talk of rights without any talk about whose duty it is to uphold that right, and how there might be duties which are not captured by rights at all. This is enormously an important and neglected topic in political philosophy, whose implications for free speech and communicative ethics are only just being seen. I'm going to take up the role of background enabling conditions, which mean, and that's what we've been hearing today already, that free speech is not hands-off. Free speech is not something you have when you haven't got someone about to clap you in jail. It's not only that, and this is a theme in Jonathan's work, it's not just a negative state hands-off, it's about having a certain power, having a certain capacity, and that takes enabling conditions. And those enabling conditions include the speech practices of organizations that do not themselves have a right to free speech, namely the media. This is another theme from Onora's work that we've been looking at today. And I want to talk about getting ethics back into justice, which is going to be the theme of her lecture this afternoon. That quotation, we as a free people have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. Now just imagine somebody says, well, what I say is okay because I am living in a post-truth world. And so I don't need to, why are they saying that? Well, I don't need to give evidence, I don't need to support it, it's not in the business of truth. I am living in a post-truth world. Imagine someone uttering that. Is what they're uttering true? Of course, they are claiming that it's true. So you cannot, in fact, claim to be living in a post-truth world and at the same time be claiming something that has even a chance of being correct. There's a paradox about the whole thing. So in practice, we see post-truth being used not in the first personal case, oh, it's okay, I don't have to live up to any norms because I'm living in a post-truth world. Really, we tend to find it used in the third person case where we accuse other people of living in a post-truth world. And there's a good reason for that, because the first personal use is paradoxical. It also, and this brings me to my main theme, is bringing out something very deep about the connection between what we can come to know and what we can come to choose. Now, when we have this idea that we as a free people have freely decided we want to live in some post-truth world, the thought is, if we're a democracy, we can choose whatever we like, and one of the things we might want to choose is the rejection of truth. That is impossible, not only because it's impossible to say, because it's paradoxical, it's also impossible because democracy depends on a certain commitment to truth. That's been in the background of what many people we've been hearing today have been saying. What I want to do, because I want to anticipate the connection with ethics that we'll be hearing more about this afternoon from Onora, I want to say how this commitment to truth that is at the basis of democracy has its roots in a certain ethical perspective. So one of the things that Onora and I have in common also, in addition to our interest in media ethics, is also an interest in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And I think that was among the first things we ever talked about many years ago. So here is a big theme in Kant. Immanuel Kant said that when you don't know what you're doing, you're not choosing what you do. So there's a sense in which you're not acting as a full agent. He didn't put it in quite those terms. But anyone who's read the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals knows that his famous example of a lying promise, where he says, suppose somebody promises to pay you back your £50, whatever they weren't pounds, next week, and this is a lying promise. And you lend them the £50, so you think. Kant says this is a wrong at many levels. It's a wrong, first of all, because it is at odds with what he called the principle of humanity. The principle of humanity says we need to treat each other as agents, as he, in his jargon, ends in themselves. We need to treat each other as agents who are authors of our action. And if you feed someone something fake that relates to what they're going to do, you stop them from choosing what they're doing. This is a very powerful connection between epistemic agency and practical agency, which is there in the philosophy of Kant, and we find it in a very everyday place over in medical ethics, in the idea that when your doctor says to you, oh, you're just going in for a small biopsy, and you come out of the operation with an amputation, nobody mentioned Brexit in this connection, please, you did not choose to do that. And then when the doctor waves your document of informed consent in front of you, you can say, I'm sorry, an amputation was not what I consented to. So Onora has written on this topic too, the relationship between epistemic agency and self-determination, also a theme in Rowan's talk earlier today, that agency involves a certain minimal amount of knowledge. Now, where in a democracy do we have our most basic expression of agency? In voting. So voting is to democracy as informed consent is to your relationship with your doctor. To the extent that it is built on lies, you are not choosing what you do. There's a whole lot else that's wrong with the picture too. All sorts of things about the social relationship have gone wrong as well. And that's some of the things that Laura was talking about this morning. We're touching on those. So the first thing that's wrong is that democracy demands truth because you need to know the truth if you're going to be able to even vote. It's not even going to count as a vote if you have no clue what you're doing. So this relates then to many things in the background that were mentioned as ideals of democracy, whether there needs to be basic epistemic competence, whether there's equality, or whether if some people are being fed lies and some people aren't being fed lies, equality is going to be undermined, and also whether we are doing things together when we are democratic citizens choosing together who will govern us. So there's a parallel between the self-determination of a democracy and all of us in it together, and the self-determination of an agent, whether they're visiting their doctor. I could have gone into many other examples, and the other place where deceit undermines agency that is very well known to us all is in personal relationships, especially sexual relationships. When they're built on profound lies, sexual consent is undermined. So this is a very familiar point that lies can undermine agency. The other Kantian theme is drawn from his other principle, not the principle of humanity, but the principle of universalizability. The thought is, when lies are everywhere, lies are nowhere, because communication itself breaks down. That's the basic thought behind Kant's principle of universalizability that says, when you choose to do something, you need to think to yourself, could this be done by everyone everywhere? That's a kind of impartiality requirement, a universalizability requirement, and whatever you think of its merits, it's a very good thought experiment for getting a handle on the dependence of practices on individual behavior. A familiar example, this time not from medicine, but from fairy tales. So we had the troll under the bridge this morning from Jonathan, and the story of the boy who cried wolf. So the story of the boy who cried wolf is so well known. The boy falsely cried wolf over and over again and destroyed his own power of crying wolf by crying it far too often. Now, what we have in a community of speakers is the possibility of speech powers being undermined, sometimes by speakers themselves, like the boy, sometimes by other speakers who destroy their credibility. So I've made a study of certain forms of hate speech. And one thing that's very interesting about hate speech is that it can undermine credibility of speakers. So Nazi propaganda was organized around this image of the poisonous toadstool, der Giftpilz, which undermined the credibility of your Jewish neighbors who look exactly like all the healthy ones, only you mustn't trust them because they're deadly poison. So what this means is that certain speech powers can be undermined by the speech of others. And that relates to two things. The speech powers of individuals who can be silenced by the hateful speech or the speech that undermines credibility. And it also relates to the practice in general, where if things get completely out of control, you have a situation where if fake news is everywhere, news is nowhere, and fake news is nowhere either. So the thought is that certain practices depend on a certain minimal participation in the practice, and if it gets completely out of control, the practice itself is going to die out. So there are two Kantian thoughts, that agency is undermined by lies, and also that practices of communication themselves are undermined by lies. Now, these are constitutive ethical points. There are also in the background normative ethical points, which is that, even if the practice wasn't going to break down and even if agency wasn't undermined, there are moral requirements on our speech which go beyond these constitutive points. And I think that we've been partly hearing the political side of those from people this morning. So I've talked about the themes, some of the themes from Onora I'm going to be taking up. I've talked about the Kantian themes because we have this enthusiasm in common. Now, I'm also going to talk briefly about Mill, because Mill is somebody whose name is often taken in vain in connection with debates about free speech, which is a tremendous irony because Mill was the most eloquent defender of free speech, and I agree with many, many things he said. In fact, I think I agree with more of what Mill said than Onora does, but we can, maybe I'll check later. One of the things that Mill said is hugely important. One of the things he did was basically ask, what is the point of free speech? Now, that Just asking the question is progress, because asking the question means I am not just going to use free speech as a mantra to shut people up. I'm going to ask, what is the point of it? And his answer is a very famous answer. It's sometimes known as the argument from truth, but I want to call it the argument from knowledge. Well, we can call it the argument from truth. 4 reasons that free speech helps truth. It's necessary because the opinion that we might otherwise rule out might be itself true. That opinion may, for all we know, be true. Second, it may contain at least a portion of the truth, and it's only by the clash of adverse opinions that the remainder has any chance of being supplied. Third, unless it's vigorously contested, it's going to be held in the manner of a prejudice without comprehension of its rational grounds. And fourth, it's going to end up just a formal profession, inefficacious for good. Now, it is worth keeping in mind that he especially, I think, had religious freedom of opinion in mind here. So it's worth letting everyone express their views, their opinions. And for all we know, the opinions that are being expressed may themselves be true, even if they're false. The clash of adversarial opinions, it might help us get further along. Now, it's a story not just about truth, but about knowledge. And it's hugely important that what's underlying it is an instinct that the enemy is prejudice. The enemy is not just falsehood, but prejudice, a kind of unthinking prejudice. He says that if the true opinion abides as a prejudice, a belief independent and proof against argument, this is not knowing the truth. Truth thus held is but one superstition the more, accidentally clinging to the words which enunciate a truth. Now, that's the argument from truth. There are 3 other things to say briefly about Mill. One is he had a very nuanced and context-sensitive view about speech acts that are involved in the expression of our opinions. So, to take his famous case, the opinion that the corn dealers are the starvers of the poor should be unmolested when it's circulated through the press, but it may incur just punishment when it's delivered to an excited mob assembled by the house of a corn dealer. This passage is often quoted to support Mill's endorsement of a harm principle as applied to speech itself. I prefer to see it as a nuanced understanding of the nature of certain speech acts. So it's not simply that some speech acts are harmful and they should be banned. It's rather that some speech acts acquire a different kind of force when they're in a different context, and that force could be, in this case, incitement, or it could be legitimating norms for this audience rather than for that audience. So there's an audience sensitivity to the nature of speech. This touches on the issues that Laura was raising about the responsibilities of hearers as well as speakers. There's an audience sensitivity, which means that what the speech act is itself varies with the context. The huge problem for us all is, of course, that Mill's neat distinction between circulating an image in the press and yelling it in front of the angry mob, that distinction is really hard to maintain, especially when circulating it in the press can then swiftly be effectively waving it in front of an angry mob. So that's a hard problem. Another thing to say about Mill is that he wanted to include other hearers. He said that truth has no chance, but in proportion as every side of it, every opinion which embodies even a fraction of the truth, not only finds advocates, but is so advocated as to be listened to. That's a bit of Mill that people never remember. And it involves the obligations of listeners, which Laura was raising. It involves having contexts where speech can be heard, and it means that when certain groups are silenced by structural issues, not just by the state, that itself is an infringement on the values that are at the heart of free speech. Now, there's much more to say about Mill, but I'm not going to say it here. I'm just going to throw out one thought here, which is basically taking up something that Laura said. Laura said it's possible when you think about the question, what is the point of free speech and what is the point of democracy? It's possible when you get clear on what its point is to then say, well, what would it need for us to achieve that point? In other words, to reverse engineer the argument you've just heard. So Mill says, when these conditions are in play, we are going to get knowledge. And that's really good because it involves the contribution of choice, the doing things together, what democracy needs. Now, when these conditions are in play, if this is the goal, and these are the conditions, but we find the conditions don't quite get us to the goal, then what's clear is we need those conditions plus whatever else is needed to get us to those goals. That's what I take Laura to mean when she talks about reverse engineering arguments for free speech. This is what we need to get this wonderful thing. This, we find out empirically, is not going to get us quite that wonderful thing. What else does it take? And norms relating to the press and the norms that are going to enable the press in its function of helping citizens speak truth to power, hold the government accountable, understand what it is they're doing so that they don't think they're going in for a biopsy and they're going in for an amputation. All of this, if something more is needed, then we have a free speech argument for that something more. So what I'm saying is not only is it a matter of free speech sometimes coming into conflict with other democratic values such as equality, free speech itself demands exactly the sorts of communicative norms that we are talking about. So I now want to say one thing in the remaining time. Does this mean I've got the number of minutes left, it says? Okay, good. Okay. I want to say one more thing about communicative ethics, which takes up an idea that we heard Onora express this morning, which was about duties. We hear a lot about rights of free speech. We don't hear much about duties of either hearers or speakers. Now, I've said that Mill's argument leads to a truth-oriented motivation for free speech. That doesn't mean only utter sentences that are true. That would be too hard for any of us. It does mean that truth-oriented speech needs certain norms to apply to it. We need conditions under which truth can flourish, and what Mill is looking for is the conditions under which free speech can flourish. Now, what then are the obligations on speakers? Motivated partly by these considerations, but more by some other, in fact, somewhat Kantian considerations, the legal theorist Shona Shifrin has argued that there is no free speech right to tell lies. In other words, she interprets the ethics of free speech to require sincere speech. It doesn't necessarily require truthful speech, but it requires sincere speech. So speech whose point is simply the making of money, without constraints of sincerity, without constraints of truth, without constraints of evidence, whatever, it might have many merits, including making money for the shareholders, but also including knowledge, including entertainment. It might have many merits, but it doesn't have the merits that belong to it qua exercise of free speech. It might have some other merits. So, but we can't just simply wrap ourselves in the flag of the First Amendment, so she says, as someone who's been used to arguing with Harvard First Amendment lawyers. Sorry. Okay, so I want to agree in part with this thought that free speech doesn't protect a right to lie. My motives being, in part, the choice-oriented Kantian thought that we need to determine ourselves what the government is going to be. We need to be able to hold the government accountable, and also in part because the very practices of communication are necessary for democracy. By the way, they're also necessary for us as human beings. I missed out this crucial part of Mill, where he said freedom of opinion and freedom of expression of opinion is necessary for the well-being of humanity. So this is in addition to what we need for democracy. Even if we were in a tyranny, we would need free speech for our well-being. So I want to draw on some thoughts. No, let me just put this out front. Shona Shiffrin has got into a lot of trouble for saying free speech does not protect a right to lie. I think the criticisms are mistaken of what she's saying, and I want to add to what she says that free speech does not protect a right to utter backdoor lies. So I'm introducing to you a new idea, an idea of backdoor lies. Now, a backdoor lie is just like a lie, except it's not explicitly asserted. I'm really interested in this because I don't just work in ethics, I also work in philosophy of language. And one of the things I found absolutely fascinating when I testified to the Leveson Enquiry was reading the testimony of many, many other groups who were talking not only about the violations of privacy norms, not only the invasion into one's own private life that is hugely important, and I'm not touching on that, even though it is hugely important, but also the testimony of groups who said that media speech, it was often cast as media speech is undermining equality, and I wanted to say it's actually undermining free speech as well. How is it undermining equality? Well, testimony from refugee groups, testimony from women's groups talked about how certain forms of speech was racist or sexist. What did they mean by that? I want to suggest that they meant that certain forms of speech were telling certain backdoor lies about certain groups. I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, but here's one from the infamous Swan Bake episode, infamous in Britain. So Swan Bake became the label for a scandal in the press where it had turned out, where one of the tabloids had a headline that went something like this: "Asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans." Okay, so just think about that headline for a minute. I'm really interested in that headline. One really interesting thing about headlines is that you don't need quantifiers in them. Quantifiers are words like all Fs are G, or most Fs are G, or some Fs are G. We don't know how many. We just have this noun at the beginning: asylum seekers, unquantified. Asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. Now think of that as a philosopher of language, and I think, wow, asylum seekers, I noticed the no quantification, how many? Who knows? Asylum seekers are being used as a label, as a sort of supposedly neutral label, but edging into a generic. It's not quite a generic, it's because the thing about headlines is that they can purport to be true on the basis of just one example. Suppose just one asylum seeker had barbecued just one of the Queen's swans. It would have been okay to report that as asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. So there's something interesting about headline speak there. Asylum seekers barbecue, so the asylum seekers, it edges into generics. What's a generic? A generic is an unquantified general statement that philosophers of language and psychologists have been studying recently because they're a tremendously interesting source of stereotyping thinking and stereotyping behavior. You think, oh, this labels a kind. And then you think, oh, this labels a kind that most things coming under that kind belong to. So it becomes a statistical generalization. Most asylum seekers barbecue the Queen's swans. And then it becomes sort of metaphysical, reifying. Oh, they are the sort of people who would do that. Then, of course, you've got funny little things like the Queen's Swans. Talk about an obscure bit of patriotism. How many people, of course, everyone knows that to be a true British patriot, you have to know that all the swans in Britain belong to the Queen. Actually, they don't. I think some belong to St. John's College by some complicated arrangement that I don't understand. Okay, so there is a backdoor speech act in that headline. By the way, that headline was also a lie, a straight-out, old-fashioned lie. Not one asylum seeker had barbecued one of the Queen's swans. Okay, there was some vague story. It never ended up with a single case. What I'm saying is, even if there had been a single case, there would be a backdoor lie in the use of generics. Backdoor lies are familiar to us. Paul Grice, the philosopher of language, talked about conversational implicatures. The philosophy professor whose letter of reference says, well, Rae Langton has excellent handwriting. Okay, so if that's what his letter of reference says of me, then he has damned me. So even though he said something nice. So conversational implicatures can be backdoor lies. Clinton, when he said there is no sexual relationship, that was a backdoor lie, even though it was an explicit truth, because there was a sexual relationship. The president, this is one from last week, the president believes the climate's changing. It's always changing. Great. That is not being pinned down on whether the climate is changing as a result of human contribution. Another one, that's just locker room talk. Locker room talk, used of a very famous utterance, which I'm not even going to repeat in this distinguished company. That's just locker room talk. Locker room talk is being used as a referring expression, like asylum seekers, like the Queen's Swans. When there's a referring expression, you think there's a point to having a label for this kind of thing, and that's why, not very much, but a few athletes got up and said, what do you mean? What do you mean locker room talk? They were trying to block the presupposition that locker room talk labeled a social norm where it is okay to talk that way, for instance, in men's locker rooms by the sports field. Okay, so backdoor speech acts are also can be backdoor lies. And by the way, this is true whether or not they're assertions. To take the most famous case from the history of lies, oops, that red means I'm over time. Is that right? St. Athanasius famously, cleverly said, when he was escaping from his enemies, they said, where is St. Athanasius? He said, in disguise, he is not far from here. And everyone says, what a clever response. It was a backdoor lie because it implicated that he was not Athanasius. And by the way, it would have been a backdoor lie if it had been a question, who's Athanasius? Or if it had been a command, go upstream if you want to find Athanasius. There are backdoor lies all over the place, and I want to say that our duties to speak the truth include a duty to speak the truth in what we say through the back door, as well as what we say explicitly. I am out of time. I just want to say that some of these conclusions, as you will hear, anticipate the lecture we'll hear from Onora this afternoon, that there can be no justice without ethics, and this applies to free speech as to everything else. Thank you.